The lecture tonight is on philosophy before Socrates, and although we were speculating in the half an hour between the meditation hour and now that maybe the weather was going to be too nice and nobody'd show up, there's actually a nice crowd here, and we're excited to see you all. And so, as always, I'll just give as a little pre-warning or side note is that my background is specifically in history as opposed to philosophy, and so even though I have been trying to study a lot of philosophy in the last couple decades, I end up having it through the prism of history, and so it's a little bit of going to another second language for me, but hopefully as a result I won't overzealously sell like, oh, I know it all or something like that, but rather we can try to put it all together in easy to digest pieces, we'll see. All right, so one of the issues that's going to happen for these philosophers before Socrates is questions of language. And in some ways, many of them weren't even aware that these kind of questions of language exist. They're living in their own linguistic context. They don't have the history behind them that they are aware of. Historiography hasn't been invented yet. And so they are perhaps not aware of different linguistics, and linguistics aren't there yet. And so anyway, so we maybe now have a little bit more perspective on it. And so I want to ask here, which of these, if we're going to take the very classic Dictionary of the English Language by Samuel Johnson, so one of the very early English dictionaries, which of these is a fish?
Probably all of them.
So Elizabeth says all of them. Everybody agree?
No,
That's the trick?
No, it's a tuna only.
The tuna only. So we do have disagreement. So Elizabeth got it. The answer, according again to Samuel Johnson's dictionary in 1755, it's actually also true for the original Webster's dictionary, which is another 70 years later, although Webster's dictionary acknowledges that there has begun to be a new definition that some scientists are proposing. But the dictionary is fish, noun, singular, animal here that inhabits the water. An animal that inhabits the water. So that's the original idea or the word fish. So that would then, of course, include lobsters, whales, even turtles, octopus, tuna, clams. So if we have this then, from that time period until the present, we have this, our definition of the word fish has changed. So we pretty well accept now what Robert is saying is for the definition of fish, which is to say, before we said an animal that inhabits the water, now we say just the tuna, right? So in other words, a gill-bearing, aquatic, craniate animal that lacks limbs with digits. And so hopefully I'm getting that right as the biological definition, but essentially that's cutting out things like clams, right?
And whales.
And whales.
They don't have gills.
Because they don't have gills. So one of those things, like we say, we tend to always say, this is a very common thing that's to kids and actually adults who end up doing it. The whale's upside down?
No, it's not.
You sure?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So whales aren't fish, according to our new definition of the word. And we tend to say that, right? Because whales are mammals. And so even though, according to the old definition of the word, any creature that lives in the sea, explicitly including whales, so like Jonah and the whale, he is in a giant fish, which is to say a whale. But they were fish according to the original meaning, just not according to the meaning we have now.
So whales always come to the surface to exchange airs. They're not going to shoot their...
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because they don't have gills. So unlike what our not modern definition of fish, which includes animals that have gills and fins, and all, well, they have fins, right? But they don't have, but they, like you say, they go to the surface and they exchange their water. And I guess, for example, I also was told, maybe this is correct or not, that, so we can't go around and drink as mammals, we can't go around and drink seawater. Right? So if you were to do that, you say water everywhere, not a drop to drink. You're not supposed to, when you're out on that raft after the airplane, to sit around and drink the water, right? So you're supposed to avoid that. And so apparently, and I'm no expert, I'm not a marine biologist, but apparently, so how do dolphins drink? They're mammals.
Well, they come to the surface.
They come to the surface and get all the water that's on the surface, or what? They get the air from up there.
Either from their food or they have some mechanism for getting the salt out of the water.
Some animals have salt glands that they can secrete the salt.
Uh-huh. Apparently the dolphin, I'm not sure which ones, but apparently dolphins are able to get it out of what they eat. And so apparently dolphins are able to just process all of the water, fresh water out of all the food that they eat, and that's where they're getting the water from that they use, because they're not using the seawater for water. And apparently, I just read, I saw this on a British quiz, so called Quite Interesting. And so whether or not this is true, this is not a real source. I just was hearing this the other day. Anyway, so apparently also in captivity, if you squirt dolphins with water, they can drink fresh water, but they have no difference between thirsty and hungry in terms of their perception. And so if you fill them up with water, they won't be able to actually get food because they won't be hungry. But anyway, that's what I'm told. So anyway, so it's not. So now we have had a different definition. So we had one definition for the word fish. Now we have a different definition that's broadly accepted. The two change. And so, but part of the perils then of redefinition is that things get left behind, right? So, for example, a cuttlefish. Well, that's not a fish. A starfish is not a fish. A crayfish is not a fish. A jellyfish is not a fish, and all shellfish are not fish, right? And so even though we call them fish, but they're not fish, because that's what's happened now, because we changed what a fish is, right? And so what we could have done is, if we have this thing, which is an animal that inhabits water, that's a perfectly valid category of thing. We used to call that a fish. Now we say an aquatic animal, right? So we don't have a new word for it, but necessarily we have a phrase. We didn't used to necessarily ever care enough about this to have a word for it, but now, obviously, biologically, it's an important thing because it's an evolutionary category and all this sort of thing. And so now we didn't, from no word particular, now we have a word, which is fish. And so that's how we ended up doing that. However, we could have gone a different way with this if we'd wanted to, right? So we could have kept fish as a word for this thing, category of thing, and we could have come up with some other word for the type of fish that a fish is. So I'm saying a gills fish or whatever, because it's got those components. But we could have come up with something, and then we could still have had shellfish and jellyfish and all the other kinds of fish, mammal fish, but because those would have all been aquatic animals, right? Anyway, but we didn't do that. And we've made other kinds of changes like that when we do kind of evolution. Like a huge one that happened in the middle of the 20th century was we ended up deciding that man, the word man specifically means males. And then that ended up it just ended up ruining 1,000 words, because we have this suffix man that meant human, and suddenly now, and prefix mankind and things like that, and we end up having to make them all, Congress person and everything else like that, or figure out other ways, and so there was instead of, steward, or just, anyway, different ways where we got rid of that. Whereas if we could have just changed the one word man, so we have woman, and if we could have come up with something, and I don't know what it would have been, because it's very hard to introduce a neologism and make it stick, but if we could have said, hey man, or whatever, to go along with woman, then we wouldn't have had to ruin the entire language. Anyway, we already did, so it doesn't matter.
We spoke German, and we had man and mensch.
Man and mensch. Yeah, so we could have come up with something. But anyway, we don't often think of this. And anyway, this kind of thing is continually ongoing. Here's another one that has been attempted. So, according to the current botanical definition, which of these 8 things is a berry?
Shaheen is not allowed to.
Shaheen knows the answer. Does anybody else know the answer?
I would bet all of them.
They're all berries?
I would bet.
Okay, so Elizabeth got it right last time. Now this time she's all in again. Maybe it's just she always says all of them. Anybody else? You're bright not to guess. This is So, according to the botanical definition, the berries are the banana, the cucumber, the grape, the tomato, and the eggplant.
Seeds inside.
And the strawberry, raspberry, and mulberry are not berries. And so, and it's not as easy as seeds inside, so I'm sorry to say. So there's actually, because these actually are even different thing than this, because there's, and I don't remember what they all are, but they're, anyway, so there's all kinds of composite fruit and multiple fruit. So anyway,
For some reason it would really a fruit, it's actually the swollen part of the receptacle from the original flower, and this real fruit is what we call the seeds.
Oh, okay. So the strawberry isn't even a fruit now. So just so that we know.
The little tiny seeds that are the real fruit.
Yeah. So we used to have a definition, or in fact it's still commonly understood, of a berry is something like a small pulpy pitless fruit. And by the way, we'll put fruit in quotes here because it's the old definition, non-botanical definition of fruit, often brightly colored, juicy and rounded. It doesn't have to be edible because there are poison berries in the in our general understanding of the word berry, but there is now a new botanical attempt to redefine the word berry. So, and apparently that is fruit produced from the ovary of a single flower where the ovary's outer layer develops into an edible pericarp. And so that's what a berry is now. And so that's why it includes like a cucumber and an eggplant, but it does not include berries. So some berries. So, okay. So I want to say then, with that, little bit of a preface and a kind of a flexibility in our understanding of tangible things in just recent times, when we look back millennia to understand the ideas of ancient thinkers, we are saddled with lots and lots of our own definitions, and in fact layers and layers of inherited ideas that we have to mine down through to get to words that we are frankly translating from ancient Greek to our present-day English. So we see then ancients through a highly distorted and dim lens, and our general bias is actually to be dismissive of archaic thought especially. We maybe are pretty impressed sometimes with some of the things that some of the ancient people think of. We say, wow, they really got pretty good at Archimedes really, measured the circumference of the earth or something like that, and then we're pretty astounded because normally we don't think very highly. When ancient people use then the terms that we translate into modern English, instead of dismissing them, where we say things like whales aren't fish, I think we should try to listen to what they mean. So when they're talking about a whale and they call it a fish, we should then try to figure out what it is that they mean by that word fish, because they're not usually just saying things because they're really, really stupid people. In general, it's because the terms have had a variable meaning. I mean, we've had many examples of these. One of the things we've done when we've done maps is I talk about, for example, the change in the definition of continents, right? And so the ancient Greeks understood the world to have 3 continents. The continents are Asia, Europe, and Libya, which we then later start calling Africa because of the Carthaginians. But anyway, so we can say Asia, Europe, and Africa. And the boundary, though, between them is not this Suez Canal, which didn't exist, or the Isthmus of Suez. The boundary between Africa and Asia is the Nile. So in other words, Asia goes all the way around to the side of Egypt where the Nile is, and then the delta is its own little thing. And then Africa starts on the other side of the Nile. Likewise, Europe doesn't go to the Ural Mountains like we tend to make it now. It goes to the Don River. And so that's the thing. And so the definition of continent, therefore, has nothing to do with what we now use for the definition of a continent. So now continent is essentially a discrete large landmass, like in best case scenario Australia, which is sitting down there without touching anything. But otherwise, let's say like North and South America are pretty close to not touching, and so therefore are their own little continents, their own 2 continents instead of just one. And same thing that's true for Africa and Asia. And Antarctica, of course, is just like Australia all by itself. But then Europe, by our new definition, isn't really a continent, right? Even though it tends to get counted as one because of this grandfather clause that Europe has. But essentially, Europe is a subcontinent of Eurasia, in the same way that India or China are. Okay, so anyway, so those terms change, and what ancient people mean by continent, therefore, is a very different thing than what we mean. So in that same way, now that we're getting to talking about the Pre-Socratics, This is going to be important when we're talking about things like the four elements. So one of our pre-Socratic philosophers here, Empedocles of Achragos, which is in Sicily, Agrigento, he's credited with the proposal that everything in the cosmos is composed from four, he actually says roots, but later that gets called elements by later philosophers. So air, earth, fire, and water, so we're pretty familiar with those four elements. Aristotle adds ether, so he makes it a fifth, or a quintessence, which is to say the fifth essence. So these are the four essences. So now we define the word element obviously as a species of atoms having the same number of protons in their atomic nuclei. And so we often will say then on air, earth, fire, and water, water is not an element. And we are quite correct that according to our modern definition, water isn't an element. And water is, as we know, a chemical substance that is made up of molecules that are containing elements, hydrogen and oxygen, right? So H2O. And so that's what we understand that. But that is not also what I'm going to argue anyway. Empedocles isn't trying to say that, anything like that, because no one has theorized anything about protons yet. Okay, so what is he doing with these four elements? So one of the things that we can see is, as he's looking at these four things, and he's calling them air, earth, fire, and water, he's looking at different, let's say, phases, what we maybe think of as phases or states of matter. So the idea of energies, which are being represented here by fire, gases, which are being represented by air, liquids, water, and solids, earth. And he's theorizing about the cosmos based on, observing essentially those kind of phases of matter as opposed to elements in the sense that we think of element today. Although he also is arguing about that these phases are more substantial than we also understand them to be, based on our atomic theory. So anyway, so a diagram that ends up getting made by, I think this is actually now by Aristotle, who's following after them, is essentially we have these things that are in opposition, fire and water, air and earth, and then between them they have these characteristics or universal qualities as they're developing an understanding of. So, which is to say, air and water are wet, earth and fire are dry, fire and air are hot, and water and earth are cold. Those are essentially the qualities that they're understanding, and they're trying to create a system of how qualities work and how substances work. So, in the same exact way that we tend to poo-poo I'm trying to think if I'm going to say that adjective, Empedoclean elemental theory, we tend to be very positive and nice to Democritus with his atomic theory, since we find it similar to our own atomic theory. So Democritus, along with his teacher, Leucippus, is generally credited with correctly, to some extent anyway, formulating atomic theory of the cosmos. And so essentially this classical atomism, as opposed to what we have now, essentially holds that all matter is composed of small indivisible particles called atoms, which are moving around in a void. So essentially everything around us is little tiny pieces of matter, and they are invisible to us until they get all pieced together, and they are moving in a void, and that's how they move, because they're in a place and then void is there, it goes to void, and so forth. Democritus then also, though, as opposed to where we understand atoms now in our present day atomic theory, he saw atoms as inert particles, as opposed to the very dynamic particles that we picture them as, and he sees them as interacting mechanically because they don't have the theories of electromagnetism and the other ways that we understand the different forces that make up atomic theory, right? And so instead, he pictured all of the iron atoms as having little hooks and little ways that they would immediately, when they get together, then they would lock together, which is why iron then would become more like a solid. So when all those little iron atoms get together, they want to lock in together and they make a very strong thing.
Did he not ever go into to a blacksmith's shop.
to see it all heated up and everything like that and becoming molten. Yeah, exactly. Well, so this is a problem that they have, though. So, and this is a problem that they are going to be facing in all these cases, which is when a thing undergoes change, is it still the thing? So this is almost the core question that all of them are arguing over. And I'm sure that when he says this thing about iron, his rival is going to ask the question that you just asked. because they're really fighting over this question of identity. Are you still the thing you are once you take a block of ice and melt it and it's now a cup of water, and you boil it away and it, and it's gas, is there what happened? Do you still have water, or is something completely gone? Have you eliminated it? Okay. And so in the same way, he saw water atoms then as smooth and slippery, and so that's why when they get together until they freeze, they become like a liquid, right?
How did you explain freeze?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we don't have all of their work. so in
Where he lived, when did they have ice?
yeah, it's possible. Yeah, so maybe in the Mediterranean, he's not getting too many snowy Christmases, or they don't have Christmas. But anyway, so yeah, that's possible. Although they would have it on top of the mountains, presumably. I don't know. So anyway, so in that sense, maybe they're not thinking about it as much. But the other part of it, I would say, is we don't have, unfortunately, as we're dealing with all of these pre-Socratics, with very few exceptions, do we have almost much of anything of what they have. We had, for Empedocles, is actually one of the better preserved ones, and we only have just a little fraction of his work. In general, what we have is what later philosophers who are looking back, so especially Aristotle, like to write about everything, and one of the things he would write about is essentially the history of philosophy and things like that. And so as a result, he would cite different past writers and argue with them, but then also suggest that different ones were the first to say different things. And so essentially, when later writers quote an early one, we have the quote. In rare form do we have any of their texts, especially for many of these guys. So anyway, between Empedocles and Democritus, then, two of our pre-Socratics, I'm just going to say here that Democritus isn't as right as he's sometimes given credit for being, because again, we can ask simple questions about, how are these melted iron atoms, what's happening to them? And then Empedocles is also less wrong, I think, than he's sometimes portrayed. But essentially, both are trying to use logic to theorize about how the cosmos works, especially in response to the arguments of Parmenides. And we'll talk about Parmenides and why he poses such a logical conundrum for everybody that the whole next generations have to continuously be trying to get out of his trap. But the new thing, or the thing that is kind of emerging as being a little different here, that each one of these reformers is doing is they're going from where people had been content before to listen to Hesiod and Homer, so the great epic poets, who are essentially telling about how classically and mythologically creation and other stories and how the universe works, how that had been understood from the time of the bards on down, and going to that authority and that tradition and saying, okay, well, this is how we understand to do this. This is a kind of a conscious effort to think about, based on the current observations, to say, you know what, we still will be quoting Homer and Hesiod, but we also are on our own rationally thinking about how are we seeing it working. And so in that sense, I don't want to overstate it, because I think we also tell the story of the beginning of philosophy as being this complete break from everything that went from the past, and that's also not true. But it is the beginnings of something emerging that we can start to say is a little new.
Didn't the Orientals have an element system in place
Yep.
before these guys?
So this idea of the four elements is not unique at all to the Greeks. People have observed essentially the phases of matter, and in East Asia, I think there's 5 elements as well. There's also other elements. I mean, there's also an element system in India. And so this is not only them, no. There's a lot of these ideas that are spread across
Okay, but
Eurasia, yeah.
First, just looking from the Greek.
This is all Greek. So when I'm saying pre-Socratic philosophy, that means Greek philosophy before Socrates. So we're kind of narrowly focused in on that this time. So one of the times of things that we also talk about a lot in here is we talk about the dangers of periodization and categorization, and also citing firsts. And when we're dealing with the pre-Socratics, almost everybody gets cited as the first guy who did X or the first guy who did Y or Z. And so that should be an alarm bell for us, usually. But essentially, one of the things that we've done when we looked at, and many times in the past, we've said, okay, if we have this continuity from this orange time of prehistory to the blue time where we are, that there is a spectrum of ongoing change, and the different people in it are quite different. We are very different in our era from Democritus, right? But when we make these lines and we say, okay, this is now the ancient world, Rome fell, now we're in the Middle Ages, or Columbus discovered America, now we're in modern times. When we make those kind of lines, those are somewhat arbitrary when we're deciding where those are. And if we take those lines out, so this guy may be in the last ancient philosopher, this guy might be the first medieval philosopher because we drew that line. That's why they're that way. And same thing, the first modern philosopher, we've decided that Machiavelli or whatever maybe, he's going to be the first modern philosopher because he's on this side of the line, whereas Petrarch or somebody is on the other side of the line, right? Or Aquinas. And so, but if we take the lines away, what we kind of end up finding out is that somebody at the beginning of antiquity and we were saying at the end has less in common because so much has happened than somebody that is much closer in time to the first medieval guy. Likewise, the first medieval guy maybe has less in common to the last medieval guy than the first modern guy, right? Because, in fact, we just drew those lines there. And if we drew them other places with periodization, things would look differently, right? And I could have done the same thing. We just did ancient, so it's very shorthand with ancient, medieval, and modern. We could also do the same thing with French, Provençal / Catalan, and Castilian, right? And all the villages from Paris, down to Perpignan, to Barcelona, to Madrid, and they would all be like this, where they have dialect changes throughout time, where they would be each one of them is a little different from each other, and they all are closer and closer on a spectrum. And then we drew, at a certain point, nationalism drew lines between France and Spain, and suddenly they're those two different ways. And in some cases in Spain, Catalan survived more than Occitan survived, but essentially Occitan would have been much closer to Catalan, anyway, than Catalan is to Castilian.
To Spanish.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so those again, that we could draw the exact same thing with linguistics. There's all kinds of different ways where when we make these lines, that actually, we should be leery of the lines, and we should beware then of firsts. So when anybody says this is the first time that they did this in the modern era, then that should be just, okay, what does that mean? So. Okay, and the last one of these I wanted to hit, I think, is our modern preconception of gods. Which when they appear in the movies, so they've movies are getting sexier. So anyway, but in the 80s anyway, the Olympic gods in Clash of the Titans, they're wandering around being very formal and like statues, and they're still being like statues in 2011. So when we hear the word God, we tend to look at that in a very limited sense of the anthropomorphic, supernatural being, and we think of the Greek myths especially. So we always have a mythological prism for it. But that's certainly true. And that's one of the ways that the Greeks viewed their gods. But they also are viewing their gods as things like lightning, the river that is next to them. The Don Valley River is a god. The sun is a god. Things that are not anthropomorphic even, things that are things that you feel. So erotic desire, or there's different ways of having love, but erotic desire is like a very powerful force as far as the Greeks are concerned. Fertility of crops and things like that is a huge force that's really, really important. War is a huge force that's important. And then things like death, wisdom itself, Sophia, so philosophia, love of wisdom, it's a goddess. Fate. For some of these philosophers, fate is even a more serious level of God, that all the gods are subject to fate.
Nemesis.
Yeah, exactly. So there are all sorts of those things which, for then ancient Greeks, this question is not about believing in gods. Do you believe in lightning? Of course. Do you believe in death? Yes. So this wasn't really the core question. This believing in becomes a question, especially because of Christianity. So specifically, when Christianity emerges, the writings of Paul, who's the first Christian writer we have access to, Paul emphasizes in a crazy way for the first time belief. It's not belief in God, but he is asking everybody to believe that Christ is Lord, that Jesus is Christ and Christ is Adonai. And so essentially there is a sense in early Christianity because of Paul that you have to believe essentially that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and that the Jewish Messiah is essentially a part of the Godhead, which is to say the God that you cannot see, the Creator, who is can't be named and can't be seen as invisible and everything beyond, and so therefore it's impossible to interact with, that we can't say that name, so the God's name, which we say Jehovah in the King James Bible, or Yahweh, but anyway, it's blasphemy to say the name, and so it's only the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton, and instead, when learned Jews get to that point in the scripture, instead of saying the name that they can't say, they say Adonai, which means Lord. And so the idea that Paul is making everybody believe is Jesus is Lord, which is to say Jesus is what you say or envision in place of seeing the Creator, which we can't say or see. So anyway, it's a complicated thing that the Christians ended up with, but it's what made belief be the important thing. That's the big change. It wasn't a big deal for pagans about belief. You were experiencing the gods all the time. You may think of different ones of these things as more important. You may be a complete fatalist, and so then fate is the most important god to you, or you may also think of fortune as your major god, or any number of those things. Okay. So when we had Empedocles here, we had mentioned it before as an elemental theory, and in some cases then Empedocles and the other Pre-Socratics are viewed in our history of science narrative or the history of philosophy narrative as being, let's say, wholly secular. And what they're doing is they're getting rid of superstition and religion, and instead what they're doing is creating secularism and rationalism. And that is a modern Enlightenment prism that we put and impose on ancient peoples. Empedocles isn't doing any such thing. He is equating, actually, as he writes in his system, these 4 elements, so energy, gas, solid, liquid, earth, fire, and water, with cardinal divinities. So essentially, he is very focused on the idea of opposites, and so he's doing these kind of diametric opposites. And so for him, then, anyway, we have Zeus and Hera, Hades and Persephone, so the king and queen of the heavens and the king and queen of the underworld, as essentially emblematically representing these elements that are making up the world. So as opposed to an anthropomorphic god, they are the prime elemental forces as he's seeing them. So anyway, and so here's his big cosmic vortex. I like diagrams, and so the fact that he's got a kind of a wild system, I thought if we could just kind of look at it real quick. So Empedocles here, who's one of the pluralist school in the Pre-Socratics, essentially he's seeing, that just means plural means he isn't seeing like one source. That's why he's got these 4 sources. In addition to the 4 sources of the 4 elements, he has 2 important cosmic powers, which are, where did it go? Strife and love. And strife is the force that is leading everything into disorder or chaos. So the more you add the force of strife, or strife is the attractive force that's leading to disorder and chaos, love is leading to the force of order. And so as things become more ordered and less ordered, he envisions essentially a universe that has 2 different in 4 places, 2 different worlds. We have our world, our cosmos, where it has filled with life, everything in it, all matter, and everybody is all living. But it's under the kind of sway of strife. So he's seeing the world is filled with kind of all this chaos and things like that. So all the divine forces are not leaving an ordered picture because of where we are in our world. But there is, he theorizes, an equal and opposite counter world. It's not antimatter world, but anyway, not in antimatter in our sense, which is existing. We can't see it, but anyway, it was existing, and it's moving now towards order, where they're more living life in a more orderly thing under the power of love. And as these cosmic vortex swirls, when it gets to perfect, kind of this perfection of order, so if you get too close to love and the universe gets there, it'll be lifeless. If it's all orderly, there's nothing to move or anything like that, nothing can change. And if you get where there's too much strife and everything is moving and there is so this is like the four elements are completely static and separated. Here they're all in a whirl and they're all in a chaotic swirling around, and there's no forms left because everything is just, chaos like that. So there's also no life there. So anyway, it's a very elaborated system. We don't know too much. I mean, he's one of the guys, like I say, at Pre-Socratic, that we have kind of the most of his work, and so this is why we can kind of make diagrams of what he's talking about. But you can kind of see then this has become a very complicated system that is not, it's not entirely just based on observation anymore. So now we've gotten to some pretty theoretical stuff that is related in some ways to categories that we probably call religion, but are now new religion or a big reform over and above what, let's say, he would have grown up with as the traditional explanations, either in the cults of the local temples he's working with, or what the poets are singing in Hesiod and Homer. So philosophers at the time faced very serious contemporary opposition. So just because you propose these kind of reforms like that, and you're suggesting that this is what everything is about, that doesn't mean that everybody around you agrees with you, because they have been reading their Hesiod or listening to their Hesiod, and they are thinking in a different way. So there's always traditionalists who react against a reformer. So for example, we have one of the funniest still plays, and someday we're just going to read this play. That'll be one of our lectures, because I love the clouds. Let's do that. We're going to put this on the calendar. So the clouds, Aristophanes, just a brilliant play. He paints his own contemporary, Socrates, as a philosophical or sophist stereotype. And the comic picture of Socrates is just absolutely hilarious. So he's in the, they have in the theaters in ancient Athens, they have what's called the machine. And so if you ever have heard of like Deus Ex Machina, so a bad storytelling, you get to the end of a plot and everything like that, and suddenly God shows up and makes it all right again, or some kind of a thing just writes it all at the end of the story because you couldn't fix the plot lines in time. And so it's called Deus Ex Machina because what would happen is at the end of a bad play like that, the God from the machine would come down and just fix it all, and so get lowered down through the special effect of the machine. So they use the machine to have the character of Socrates suspended in a basket. And so he's sitting up there just as a lazy guy in a basket, dispensing all of his sophistry. And essentially, why does he have to be up there? Because he's so ethereal that, he's just feeding essentially on the wisdom of the heavens. And all of the gods that he talks about now are simply clouds, as opposed to anthropomorphic deities. They're going to be natural phenomena and things like that. And specifically, Socrates tells then the pupil that is sent to learn sophistry from him. Essentially, it's the son of an uneducated rich guy. He sends his son there so that the son can become higher class and be a leader of the city and all those kind of things. And so he gets to be educated. And of course, then you have the same problem that always happens, which is where the young college kid comes back home and tells dad that he's a buffoon, right? And so the poor dad gets argued in a corner, and he can't argue against all of his son's new rhetoric. So it ends up being very funny. Anyway, so this pupil learns that the universe is not controlled by Zeus, no, but it's by this vortex. So there's just this. So what Aristophanes is concerned is this soulless vortex that's going on. And so as a result of learning all of these kind of truths from the sophists, from Socrates and the sophists, he no longer has to do any of the kind of traditional things that he would have had to do, like, for example, filial piety. He no longer has to be good to his dad, because why should he be good to his dad? There's no purpose for that. That had been a traditional religious thing, but now that's not an important value because he's learned that none of those values matter. Okay, so that's essentially the opposite opponents, and it's a caricature. The opposite is probably true in terms of Socrates' own behavior and desire, which is he is absolutely committed to trying to figure out how one lives a virtuous life and what we should be doing in order to be virtuous. So it's not meant to be this thing where we throw away conventional mores in order to be libertines and things like that, as it's parodied in the play. Rather, it's a very serious pursuit of virtue, right? But anyway, there's a lot of reaction against that whenever reforms are suggested. So as opposed then to this dichotomy that we sometimes have of philosophy being this thing where reason is replacing superstition and religion is this thing where dogma is suppressing innovation, my argument would be that both of these are actually within the broader blanket of what religion is, and what actually philosophers are doing is they're suggesting reform to the traditional religious views that include moralism and things like that, and cosmology. And what's happening is that there's conservative reaction to that, because anytime there is a reform, there's also reaction that happens. Okay. There's not much to talk about here. Okay. So we've had before, when we've had our lectures on Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, we've had before, as we've done Greco-Roman philosophy, essentially how lots of the different trees and lots of the different schools that we see all the way through for the next, well, actually for a long, long time after that. But anyway, throughout the whole rest of antiquity in the Roman Empire, we have essentially the Stoics, the Cynics, the Neoplatonists, the Aristotelians. These guys are all looking back to Socrates in some way or another and seeing Socrates as sort of the founder of how they understand their school. And there's some other ones that are also in the mix here that we'll mention, because this is a Pre-Socratic, so we've talked about before. So Pythagoras and the Neo-Pythagoreans, but those guys get mixed up so quickly with the Platonists and the Neoplatonists that they're also kind of part of that. Pythagoras has a huge effect on Plato. And then on the other side here, we have another Pre-Socratic, so we talked about already, Democritus and atomism. This influences Epicurus, who we've talked about as the odd man out, or the very unpopular, as far as the other philosophers are all concerned in the Greco-Roman world. Essentially the idea of what it's criticized as hedonism. So the idea that instead of, you need to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, because those are the only values that actually matter. So it's satirized, or it's caricatured as eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die kind of philosophy. So that is influenced by atomism, in part because if the explanation for all of the movement and matter and everything in the universe is that everything's just little particles that are moving around from where they are to the void, they don't have, there's no purpose in the movement of them all. And so since there's no purpose, there's no particular meaning, and so all you can come back to is where your own pleasure and pain are. And so that's essentially why that influences the Epicureans that way. But anyway, what we want to do then, so we see that so much branches out and everybody traces their way back to Socrates. But what we want to do now is, where did Socrates come from? He didn't just step off of the flying saucer. What happened to set up to where he got? So Socrates, of course, is asking questions like, what is the good life? And he's specifically trying to define universals. So what is virtue? All of these sorts of ideas like that. What is truth? And so, however, before Socrates, to get to questions like that, there were bunches of other layers of questions that we have to mine back to see where did that question come from. And so prior to Socrates and this kind of question of what's the good life, we have questions that led to that question. Are qualities universal in the same way that it seems like mathematics are universal? So they've started to see all sorts of mathematical principles that will always work like a charm. And we've had some of these in the cave where people have been able to, where Plato showed some pretty neat math tricks that we did. But a simpler ones would be things like the Pythagorean theorem, or just, anyway, 2 + 2 is 4. In other words, there are things that are universal with numbers that always work, and so those seem to be universal. Are things like qualities universal? And so that's things like, we had this before, right? With, although neither one of these is an actual sphere, we sometimes say that these two things kind of have a similar quality of sphericity or spherical roundness. And so they have that in common, even though, they're very different things, right? And so does the sphericity then, is one of these questions of universals, is that a thing? What is sphericity? Is it only a property that exists in planets and oranges, and that can't actually be compared really between the two of them because it's not an actual universal property, it's just a characteristic of each individual thing? Or is there a reality of sphericity? And of course we have a mathematical one, but is there another one that's not mathematical sphericity? So the other qualities are things like redness. Is there anything to that? Being human, being female, being liquid. And then if you did think all of those seem like, okay, yeah, that's a thing. It's a thing to be human as opposed to something else. But then what about a quality of being taller than is what now it starts to get you into trouble. Because I maybe have the quality of being taller than a whole bunch of people, but then I don't have the quality of being taller than some other people I know, right? In that case, I suddenly have both the quality of being taller than and the quality of being shorter than. And how is that possible? So these questions, are really energizing people. And so these are what immediately the people are thinking about. And it's also, you can see in that, some of the issues of language, right? That we were talking about right at the beginning with what is fish, right? So are those qualities universal like in mathematics? So before that question, we had questions like, well, can mathematics explain the cosmos? So we found out all kinds of things, like we can potentially measure like how many square feet this room is, or any number of other things, but can we describe the entire world and universe or cosmos mathematically? And it was looking like other people, we've had a lot of progress with that. Prior to that is, this fundamental question is, how do things move or change? And so we talked about that already at the beginning of this, is kind of this fundamental question of identity. If, in the case of, let's say, a human being in life, I have all kinds of memories of myself as my memory goes back to when I was about 3. I have memories of having the memories anyway. I remember what my earliest memory was, but I only remember a memory of that. But anyway, I have more reasonable memories, in the next couple decades. And I always think to myself, well, in as much as there's no photo, then it's better memory in terms of me not just remembering a photo of the memory. Anyway, so we have to do that with our own memories. But anyway, so I do know that I have existed, these 48 years. But to what extent am I the same as the baby John that was 3 that I remember, of the 17-year-old, of the 27-year-old, so obviously in terms of any of my atoms, none of those have been held onto, right? The atoms get all cycled out I don't know what it is, every 6 months, or what is 7 years? So yeah. So anyway, they have all gotten cycled out. So I have no atomic continuity in terms of having kept any of them anyway. Each one of them has replaced an earlier one or whatever, but anyway, there's none of that. And I also my memory is only so good. So, and also in any given circumstance, I will do something very different now. So if the different me's could all be put next to each other and and started from time now, we would all make very radically different choices when we are encountering different things. There would be echoes because I remember a lot of the things, but anyway, I do things differently from that. So this is a fundamental question then of identity. To what extent am I still me, or do I have any shared identity there? So we have all this change, and so is there such a thing then of self? So, and then just even more simply, how is everything in the whole universe moving? So as people are looking up, we're trying to maybe explain it later through mathematics. We're looking up in the stars. The stars keep moving around every day, and the movable stars are moving around against that background. Which is to say, the planets. How is that happening? Why is that moving? How is everything else moving? Why does anything move? Okay, and then finally, before that even, as we dig back down is, well, what is matter? What is all this stuff, and where did it all come from? So anyway, so successively, before Socrates, people were, as we're kind of going back and back and back and back, each one of these kind of questions were built on previous questions, getting back to kind of the beginning, when people are first asking these questions. And so, that's just what we needed, right? So we had before, our last diagram we had from Socrates and down, right? So now we've got, going all the way back up, the philosophical schools that are before Socrates.
Shouldn't that be Heraclitus?
That's probably, yes, it should be Heraclitus. So not Heraclitus. Heraclitus, yep. So essentially then, as the Greeks themselves, again, we don't have any of their work. We have just quotations, as I said. And so in some ways, we also only have, as the ancient Greeks themselves wrote about, who came before and who was whose teacher. And a lot of what they're saying isn't very good because it's late. In some cases, though, what I've tried to do here is credit the earliest one. And so if people are writing another 500 years later and they're saying something, it's less credible. But essentially, people look back and tend to start their understanding of where this tradition comes from with Thales and the Milesian school. So people in Miletus, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. Pythagoras may have been, or at least people claimed later, that Pythagoras had been a student of Anaximander, and so in other words was related at least went and visited Miletus. He also went on a bunch of other trips, according to legend or anyway early accounts, and so that he went to Egypt and other places before settling in Italy and essentially creating the Pythagorean school. And we've talked about that one, but we'll talk about it a little more today. Mathematical mysticism. From the Milesians over here, nearby city of Ephesus in Asia Minor, Heraclitus. And so Heraclitus is, we'll talk about anyway, but who is I don't know how much I want to summarize it. We'll get to him again. But anyway, it's essentially, Heraclitus is famous for the idea that you're never stepping in the same river. So this thing that I was just spelling out with me and my life and who is John and where is my identity, that's very Heraclitean. But in reaction to that, we'll have Parmenides, who asserts absolutely the opposite, and in fact comes to this idea that logically that change isn't even possible. And in fact, we're not changing, and that change is simply an illusion, and we have to ultimately reject our sense perception because our sense perception is going against what we can logically reason to be the case. And so he then builds kind of a really logical conundrum that people have to react to, be it through the atomists, who we've seen, who come up with that atomic theory, and the pluralists who are coming up with that elemental theory of no, there's not just one thing, monism, and no change. Rather, there is a complexity of how the universe works, air, earth, fire, and water, that is, let's say, moved by strife and love. And so from then also, we then finally get to the sophists, who have started to question what really is knowable at all, and whether any of these kind of ideas of universals or anything like that have any existence, or if instead it's more along the lines of when I was talking about the property of taller thanness. So every different individual person, taller thanness it only varies with person to person to person. And so in other words, everything is relative based on the individual person. And so then there maybe is no such thing as truth, right? And so then that's the entire environment that we'll kind of survey here that Socrates is emerging from. Okay. So one of the things that's interesting about all these guys are that as opposed to the chart that we had for Socrates and all the people that are following him, where really Athens becomes ground zero and everything is kind of going on based on the names of these different schools, the Academy, the Lyceum, the Stoa. Those are just pieces of geography run around Athens, and so it almost becomes a home game by Socrates' time and beyond. At this beginning time, though, everything is actually not happening in the central part of Greece, and instead is all existing on the fringes, which ends up being a very interesting thing. So much of it is going on over here at the edges of the Greek world in Asia Minor or Anatolia, all of which are under Persian rule. So in other words, also having influence or maybe exposure to both Persian ideas, but also the different cosmopolitan ideas that are within the empire, the Anatolian civilizations, Syro-Phoenicians, and then beyond Persia. Persia also touches India and has part of India is its province, Egyptians. And then on this other side, the Phoenicians have made it all the way over here and are on the island here with these guys. So the Greeks have settled this area that's actually where we get the name Greece. Magna Graeca is this area here, southern Italy. And so this is where people like Pythagoras, the Eleatic school, who are we going to go back here to see? Oh yeah, sophists, and also Tini, the pluralists. So in other words, over here on Sicily. So on the fringes of the Greek world, but connected maybe to other influences, like the Etruscans. So for example, the Pythagoreans believe that in a quite un-Greek way, one of the problems that we have with tracing everything back to Greece is the Greeks are just these horrible sexists, right? And so almost all of these characters that we're talking about today, because that's who we have, are all male. And so it's unfortunate that we're only having male thought and narrative called out. But at least over here, the Pythagoreans believe that women and men both can be philosophers, and there's a difference there. And it's interesting because the Etruscans are also, as the civilizations go, pretty egalitarian gender-wise. Yeah.
I'm reading a book now that lists an author who has at least 50 women in antiquity who were philosophers.
Yeah. So they're definitely, and we should do that, especially also. I don't know how many of them are going to be in the Pre-Socratic time period. There are some.
I know of at least 2.
Yeah, and so we can be tracing that, and especially things get better. But here at this earliest time, especially that tends to not horribly the case in some of these earliest schools and the leaders. But there is more egalitarian gender ideas in the Pythagoreans. Yeah.
So we're in the Greek world, which is before the Roman.
Yeah.
The Roman world starts up and takes that turf.
Yep.
And calls it Rome.
Yep.
Okay.
So it's the same basic environment. So I'm talking here about the Greek world. This doesn't really have, this is just a terrain map. And essentially the dots here are Greek city-states and colonies.
Yeah.
And so the Greeks at this point here in the classic time period, they are largely, each individual city is its own state. And they don't have, let's say, like a big empire, like you're talking about, like the Roman Empire. The big empire that's here in the Mediterranean is the Persian Empire. And so the Persian Empire is controlling all of this territory here and all the way out to the edge of Persia to the Indus River. But there is no empire here. It's a collection of independent city-states that are fighting each other in general. And so it's like the situation, for example, in Renaissance Italy, where every one of those cities, there's no kingdom of Italy for a whole long time period. Italy is unified only in the 19th century, right? And so Florence and Siena and Modena and Padua and all those cities are their own city-state, right? And so in this same way, all of these Greek cities essentially are self-governing. They might be dominating each other in little leagues and things like that close by, but in general, they're that way. And that's true for the Etruscans too. So the Etruscans have all these cities that aren't listed here, but they would have a bunch of city-states. That happens a bunch of times in history. So the Mayans, for example, don't have empires; they have city-states, and so a lot of times it'll be like a local city. And one of the things that there's a couple characteristics of a city-state culture usually, which is that there's a lot of competition among the elites. And so they tend to do all kinds of things like build a lot of monumental architecture, they make a lot of art, they do all this kind of stuff, and then they just have bloody wars all the time. And so they're also, it's a dangerous but productive thing like the Renaissance Italy or classical Greece. But they usually can't resist empires too easy. The Greeks do a good job with the Persian Empire. It is very complicated to attack. What the Persians tried to do in terms of attacking Greece was not an easy task, actually, even though they're so much of a bigger empire. But in general, the Toltecs can come in and take over the Mayas if you've got a big enough state, because you can just manage so many more resources. And so when it comes to Rome, at a certain point, Rome controls all of this. And the Greeks have actually already had little empires by then because of Alexander and his successors. And all the little empires fall very easily to Rome. Okay, so going through all these different schools. So as we're going to start up here with Thales, right? So the Milesian school, Miletus is a Greek city in the Persian-controlled Anatolia, which is we now think of as Turkey. It's now Turkey. He's an astronomer, a mathematician, a sage. Aristotle calls him the first philosopher, which is a red flag for us, right? So he's the first. Thales then asks cosmological question, which is essentially, what is the essential nature of matter? What's the essence of it all? He's also asking questions like, if something seems to change, is it still the same or is it different? What is identity? What causes change? So all of those kind of core questions that we said are kind of at the root of the beginning of this. And so his answer, we don't have his reasoning really, we don't have his text, but we do have his answer. Ancient writers say that Thales argues that water is the source principle that is underlying all of matter. So Aristotle describes it this way when he's kind of looking back at this retrospectively. He says, logically, it's necessary that there be some nature. So if we're going to do from causation, he is going to argue from causation that there has to be either one or more than one from which become the other things of the object being saved. So, okay. So that's complicated, right? So if we were doing that thing with the boiling water or something like that, and we had an ice block, and then we had liquid, and then we have the gas, material is being saved somewhere. You know, since we're having a conservation of matter, everything's not being, we didn't destroy the ice. We destroyed a block ice, and then we made a liquid, but it's still, the water is being conserved, right? And so when we make the gas of water, then the water is being conserved. So essentially, you know, as one thing is becoming another thing, there is a component of the object that is being saved somewhere as gas that's escaping into the air in the case of a steam, as in the case of the water. In the case of all of my atoms that I'm changing out every 7 years, they've all gone, you know, down the drain and they're off doing something else now, right? And so, you know, and so they're being saved somewhere. And so there's either one underlying principle of matter, so there's like some kind of underlying material form that's the source of all of this, or there's many things. And he's saying that Thales is the founder of the type of philosophy that says that there's one and that it's water. So in other words, that the core base thing is water. Yes, we need to get, can we get the microphone? Valerie. Valerie, she's right there. Upside down. That's the back of the microphone. No, upside down.
It's upside down.
Sorry.
Okay. Another thing, a reason why water makes sense is because it's implicated in all living things. Of course, our bodies are found to, have a lot of liquid, but, growing things, plants and whatnot.
That's right.
And, all the living beings in the ocean, they seem all to be implicated with water, so.
Right, and we are aware, and we have been talking about this idea that we can actually see water changing in the different phases a lot more easily than we can a lot of other objects. And so, if we're thinking about how, let's say, if we're trying to say that everything is built out of rocks, it's very complicated to get to the idea of how is air built out of rocks, maybe, right? Whereas if we're saying, like Valerie's saying, it's all living things. If you squeeze, these things that are not berries anymore, but anyway, the water will come out of them, right? Or in the form of a juice, so it'll be contaminated water or whatever. But you'll see that there's liquid in there. If you cut somebody, they'll bleed, and so the water will come out. If we boil water, the gas will come out. So you can see, with water or liquid, being the kind of fundamental principle, it makes that kind of sense. It's also possible that we don't know for sure, but because we don't have, this would just be speculative, he can be accessing earlier Syro-Babylonian and also Canaanite, this kind of Eastern Persian ideas of a worldview where there is essentially primordial water, where everything is water and of which the land is coming out of that. He is talking about he apparently understands at this point still the world to be flat, and he argues that it's like a disk that's floating on water. And so he also is understanding cosmologically to have kind of a watery universe as also the kind of a core. So water is the first idea. So in this Milesian school then, goes from Thales to Anaximander. Anaximander continues the school, and he also has Anaximenes, and also we've said maybe Pythagoras, at least that's according to one or two early reports, as students, so influenced them. So he, though, puts his mind to it, and he says, okay, I believe in this that there is a organizing principle thing, that everything comes from like one source, but I'm not sure that I buy that it's this water business, and that there's all this cosmic water, and instead, he's suggesting that there is instead an undifferentiated mass that is like infinite and also doesn't decay. So it has some kind of a perfect quality to it. It's ageless and infinite, and from that is constantly issuing then the different kinds of mass. It's almost like if we have a bunch of stem cells and they're constantly creating all of the different tissue, it becomes air, earth, fire, and water. And so that's Anaximander's answer to this question, where does everything come from? By contrast, Anaximenes argues that the primary substance from which everything else is made is air. So anyway, so at this point they're arguing about, they have the same basic idea, but they can't decide what they think in terms of trying to they want to get to a unified principle. They want to have monism. They want to say that there is essentially one start to this all, but they're arguing about what that might be. Okay, so we had here that Pythagoras may have been interacting with these guys, but then moves off to Italy, where he has his own school. His school that he establishes is interesting, and it's one of these places where we see ancient philosophy is more overlapping with some of the ways that we think of as ancient religion more. So essentially it's almost a quasi-monastic community where they're living communally, where they also, in this sort of philosophical order of thinkers that are all living and sharing in common, they're also vegetarian. And so part of that is apparently because they have come to accept the idea of transmigration of souls, and so they believe in immortality of souls and maybe reincarnation as animals, and they don't feel that animals should then be eaten. Because, however, his followers continue to write in his name, it's sort of kind of impossible we don't have his actual works, and we can't always say what's ascribed to Pythagoras and what he might have actually, the historical Pythagoras would have had. It's a much bigger problem. We sometimes talk about that as the Socratic problem, where we can't separate Plato from Socrates. We can do it a lot better because we're really close. We can see Plato and Socrates a lot more clearly. We just don't have enough of anything with Pythagoras and all of his later followers to know exactly where he begins and the followers end. Yes?
Just the fact that these, there's more.
Want a microphone?
Yeah. I'm sorry, we need the microphone. Yeah.
I think you hit upon a point that back in those days there would be more communal living, so it would not be hard for somebody who's a little bit brighter than the rest to collect a group, and that group put together their little commune, and yeah, okay.
Well, I think, so in general, people aren't living communally. So in general, people will have their own households and they have own family and clan. And so those clans will own property and they will owe, they're part of, they're citizens, or if they're in the elite anyway of their different city-states, they're citizens and they owe things to their societies, but they're not all sharing everything in common. They may well be subject to taxes, they're obliged to have military service. There's all kinds of different things that they have to do as an obligation of citizenship. But they don't all sharing all their property in common. So this would be a different level of essentially a spiritual community that you're getting together and being devoting yourself not to worrying about all of this kind of things, worldly stuff like property, and instead you are thinking together, but you're also doing it in secret. So they also have all of the different things that they know about. They are not widely publishing. They're not meant for the hoi polloi to hear all this stuff. Instead, it's for just the initiated philosophers. So, starting out in the Persian Empire, the Greek-speaking part of the Greek cities in the Persian Empire, Pythagoras is said to have traveled widely, and including Egypt, and so different early philosophers saw, well, where is he getting things like transmigration of souls? They're speculating that this is from Eastern influence. Also, the famous theorem that we have that is known for him, so a squared plus b squared equals c squared, is in fact had already been known in India and Babylon for many centuries. And so it may be that he's the first person that introduced that to Greece, but he didn't probably make it up. However, he is, we can't tell, he's credited with a bunch of other different sorts of conceptual innovations that either him or his followers have, including things like the idea of, it could be even as much as the Earth is a sphere, that the Earth is divided into climate zones, so that there is a frigid part in the north and in the south. There's a torrid zone and two temperate zones. He also is very interested in things like harmony and harmonics, mathematics, and also numbers, but also numbers as magic, so numbers as numerology. So things like 3 is like a perfect number because it has both a beginning, an end, and a middle. So 3 is really great. 10 is the absolute perfect number, for base 10. But it's and so as a result, Pythagoreans, mystics, are not supposed to ever get together in groups of more than 10. They are interested in things like, for example, the Platonic solids is what they're called, but anyway, Plato is very influenced by the Pythagoreans. So essentially, we know very much the cube, but all the other ones, the three-sided pyramid, the dodecahedron, the isohedron, and the other one, the tetrahedron, isohedron. Yeah, icosahedron.
Interesting enough, I understand that they didn't recognize, I believe, the octahedron because they saw it as a pair of pyramids.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay, so maybe, so that's cheating, right? Okay, and so anyway, in doing all those things then, as opposed to then deciding that water or air or essentially material stem cells are the underlying component out of which all matter is coming, maybe everything is all based on math. Maybe numbers and harmonics and math are actually the perfect thing that's underlying the universe. And that also leads to a sense that there's something in there, essentially a form or an idea at the base of it all that is perfect and not subject to change. And so that's an idea that heavily influences Socrates and Plato. Okay, Heraclitus, spelled right this time. So right next to where the Milesians are, Miletus, Heraclitus then from Ephesus, and is also therefore under Persian control, and we have, again, this idea of potential Eastern influences. He sees the cosmos as dynamic and in a state of continual change and flux. And so I mentioned here, I quoted, you can't step into the same river twice, and so the river is ever going. And so even though I go and see it, and it's always the Don Valley River, or the Don River, we never see the same water, and it moves around and all that sort of thing. And so he is interested in this idea, this category of anything then that's becoming, since everything is always in a state of becoming. I'm becoming the me of 5 minutes from now. I'm no longer, I'm never longer the me from 5 minutes ago. Everything then is necessarily impermanent, so there isn't going to be any permanence as far as Heraclitus is concerned. So in response to that, off in Ilia, which is a Greek city in Italy again, so we're on these different fringes again of the Greek world, Parmenides has an opposite view, and so he's called the first metaphysician, which is another one of our flags where we're saying we're behind these firsts as if nobody had ever thought of these things before. But anyway, he is credited with it. So he disagrees with Heraclitus and instead argues this very complicated thing that it was hard to spell out last time when we talked about this, and I'm not necessarily going to be any better at it again, but anyway, we'll try. So if something now exists, it can't have previously come into being, because that would lead us to the conclusion that had previously then not existed, and we can't say that something comes from nothing, because because then we have to accept that there is such a thing as is not. So in other words, that there is this idea that there is a vacuum, and that there is movement then from is not to is. And so he argues then that this doesn't make logical sense. And Valerie is going to help us try to understand it. So.
Well, I'm not super keen on the not is argument, but I was just going to say that then it logically leads to the conclusion that what we see is mere appearance.
Yes.
And so that true reality is unseen,
yes,
hidden, and that everything we see that's changeable, moving, is
right.
merely appearance and is
it just seems to be.
illusory.
It's just
is
illusory. So ultimately, this is leading to this idea of rejection of sense perception. So in other words, our senses are constantly fooling ourselves, but we know that there is a deeper reality that we've already seen explained, like Pythagoras is explaining through mathematics. So in other words, we know that there is a mathematical perfection that exists that is real and can always be understood, and it works every single time because mathematics is perfect. So therefore, our senses, when we're seeing things, we can be tricked in all kinds of number of ways when we can show optical illusions, and any other number of ways where we think that we're tasting something and it's not. Therefore, we can't trust our sense perceptions, and instead we have to rely on something that we know is true, which is the perfection of math, and therefore and logic, as they're just beginning to formulate it. And so therefore we're rejecting then the visible world. So here's how he's phrasing it, according to, as quoted later, I think, by Aristotle. So how could what is, in other words, being, perish, how could it have come to be? For if it came into being, in other words, if it was becoming, it is not, nor is it, if it nor is it, if ever it is going to be. Thus becoming is extinguished and destruction unknown. Yes?
He never ate bread.
He never ate bread?
The bread must have always been bread.
So you just think you're just sensing that there's nothing that has been destroyed, So what exists now is now, all at once, one and continuous, nor is it divisible, since it's all alike, nor is there any more or less of it in any one place, which might prevent it from holding together, but all is full of what is. So in other words, we're all, the reality of everything is being, not becoming. There is no void. That's, and anything that we have like that, ideas of that kind of separation and change and all those sorts of things are illusions of our senses. And so the diagram here of how we got that is, being X has always been being X, because it is and it's that which is. So both of those things are that case. Because if being X, which is that which is, was once in a condition of becoming X, it would have to have been not X, is not. And so this is the Parmenidean paradox that really stumped all of these early thinkers an awful lot. In other words, this is how do you get out of this problem? And it's popularized through Zeno's paradoxes, right? And we'll show one of those just to have that. Do you want to say something, Shri?
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
It's as though they both had different pieces. They had different pieces of the pie. So with Parmenides, the thing that which is and always has been is, so for example, you have things like atoms, right?
Yeah.
And ever since our universe has existed, atoms have always existed.
That's right.
Their configurations change, but the atoms themselves are the same ones.
Right.
Right?
That's
Whereas,
the Big Bang.
which might itself have been a continuation from a previous universe, right? So there's
Right.
we don't have a
Right, so this is this
nihilo.
idea of this conservation. I mean, what is happening to the matter if it isn't, right?
Yeah.
And so in this case, like you say, we have a new explanation for how all of this matter is doing other things. Like I said, all my atoms have gone off and they're someplace else. And we understand it that way. They don't have that, and so they're wondering how could it be? And so also making that synthesis between those two paths of continual flux and of total permanent idea, this is the thing that's is leading to then Socrates and Plato and their contemporaries. In other words, how are they trying to square these two different ideas? Elizabeth.
I'm just thinking of Samuel Johnson kicking a rock, and who did he say he was refuting? Barclay? I'm sorry. These are the people who got philosophers a bad name.
Well, they did
sophists.
They did get right after this, they get parodied by Aristophanes. So we'll read that. Yeah, here.
In the current context.
He's going to get the microphone. Just a second.
Oh, I think people can hear me quite well.
No, but they can't hear on the video.
Oh, okay. In the contemporary context, there's a parallel question that I find extremely interesting, and that is the question of information.
Okay.
Because there seem to be a lot of thinkers who think that information cannot be destroyed. That if you go and burn a book and mash up the ashes, in principle you can reconstruct all the information there. Or even if it goes into a black hole, as Stephen Hawking seemed to believe that you could, all that information was still there.
Okay.
I do not agree with that at all, because where does the information come from in the first place? If it can't be destroyed, how can it, again,
Okay, yeah.
somewhat parallel.
Yeah,
to
so
what
that
you're
would be this
discussing
idea
here.
of, yeah. And this is also that's a Greek idea too, which is like infinite regress and things like that. This idea that they're arguing about here, is the universe infinite? Has it always existed? And if so, then it will always exist. But then how could it have never started? And so, like you're suggesting here, if information will exist eternally, but if it has a start date, then anyway, if something starts, doesn't it have to end?
There's a contemporary philosopher by the name of Jim Holt. Look up his TED Talk on why is there something other than nothing. It's very entertaining.
Oh, okay.
He also has a whole book on that. Why does the universe exist?
Yeah, I've heard of that. Oh, Valerie also.
Do you have too many more slides?
No. No, we're in the wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, Parmenides' theory sounds kind of wonky and very, very antiquated, but there's kind of a new way in physics, well, and in philosophy of science, of looking at, why we differentiate objects, systems, etc., from the surround. And the nature of science has been such that we tend to study things discretely. You know, whether we're studying an elephant or a star system or what have you, but we, in some ways, artificially distinguish a thing or a system out from everything else. And at the atomic level, the distinctions aren't that discrete. It's our senses that cause us to think that, you know, like, let's say the wall is separate from the air, is separate from me. But there's much more interpenetration, and if you speed up or slow down the timeline, then things kind of either fall apart or merge, you know, much more than our senses and our sense of time allows us to think. So there's actually much more.
This unity here is, like you're saying, is describing some of that. It's just when you reduce it down to a simple diagram, it looks very, very simple. But there's something going on here, like you're saying.
It's
because he's actually arguing against, like what I was showing before when I said, you know, when I drew those dotted lines and showed how the problem with periodization are and things like that and separation. So he's again suggesting that our doing that has some arbitrariness to it, and we by making different groupings, we're misunderstanding. Anyway, the connectedness.
Yeah, really the interconnectedness of everything. You know, like in some ways, you know, we are connected to the next star, to the next galaxy.
Yeah.
We just, our senses and our concepts don't really allow us to understand that or observe it.
Good point. Okay, so we'll just quickly. Oh, you have one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make one point.
Yeah.
That when we're looking at Parmenides, we have to go back to what you said originally, in the sense that we have to look at it back at what it was in those times.
Yes.
We're discussing, you know, his Parmenides' ideas of being and not being, but we can't look at it as being, well, the universe was a cosmos. They didn't have a cosmos back then. The universe was what you saw in the sky rotating around the earth. There was no idea of an expanding universe or a big bang or anything like that.
Good point.
So especially when you're looking at his philosophical ideas, we do have to go back to what it was back then. So what was being and not being back at that stage is where you start having to get into that which is not.
Good point. Yeah, so it's definitely an anachronistic prism we have when we're talking about, okay, well, in the first 5 seconds after the Big Bang, what would this have meant or something like that. And also, just in terms of this being, not being, this is something, again, as we were seeing that questions following on questions, this is building up from people who were, you know, doing this initial theorizing where, well, maybe everything's originating or quintessential, or not, that's not good. Essential, not quintessential, essential element is water, right? And so we're only a few more steps up from that, and we're now theorizing, you know, having a very sophisticated idea about being and becoming and not being and void. So, good point. Yes? 1 second, I'm sorry.
There are some essential questions. The first question was there something pre-existing? Was there a pre-existing reality, or was there nothing? That's the first question. The second question is whether what emerged from that reality, was it orderly and purposeful in its emergence, or was it arbitrary and accidental? And the third question is what exists now in reality orderly or purposeful or not?
Yeah, I agree.
Basic questions.
I mean, those continue to be basic questions for us in terms of the meaning of life, right? And so for the first question or whatever, you know, did things come into being or were they always were? Parmenides is arguing it's always been, right? So he is one of the people who is arguing for unity, and that even time and everything like that, as we're perceiving it, are illusory. And so that's a very extreme kind of position at a certain point. But then there's when we tend to have argued more recently in our modern iteration of Democritan atomism is that in the post-Enlightenment era, radical materialism is that everything can be described just as material particles, and everything is about material particles that are not doing anything according to rules, but not with purpose, right? And so that's been kind of the basis, I think, of where people have been in the majority, in terms of science, anyway. But whether or not that has made it, or where everybody is philosophically satisfied with that, is still a question. And we are continuing now to find limits to radical materialism, as now time has gone on. But those are all still very operative questions that they're struggling with right here, So anyway, we don't necessarily have to spend too much time on how essentially to take this is very complicated. Zeno was able to explain some of the issues of trying to figure out how logical mathematical perfection, is making these ideas work, or a problematic idea. And so this idea then of the idea of the runner. So every single time as the runner is going and he's trying to get a distance, he's going to the end. At some point or other, he's only halfway there, and so he's not actually there. And so at every single time, mathematically, at a certain point, he has to only be a quarter of the way, an eighth of the way, half plus an eighth and everything like that. So in other words, there's a sense that since every single one of those positions have to go, and that's infinite, so we'll always have an infinite fraction, we never actually get to the end because we have to constantly be iterating out what all of those are. So that kind of logarithmic progression is a mathematical, paradoxical problem for people who have just barely realized that this kind of thing happens mathematically, right? And so, so this idea is one of the things they're struggling with, is this ideas of infinite and limits. So anyway, from Parmenides laying down that gauntlet, that essentially is establishing the context for which the other different schools now are going to argue, as we're getting right to the immediate context of Socrates. So Socrates' generation and his immediate predecessors are focusing on answering these questions about change, so arguing that there's no, anyway, against Parmenides' argument that there is no change at all, arguing against in favor that there is something is impermanent as opposed to everything is permanent, and then arguing about whether there's void, right? So we talked about then this atomist school of Democritus, who is proposing this idea then that everything is composed of atoms and voids, and that is explicitly proposed as a counter to Parmenides' idea, right? So instead of everything ultimately being, unified and there being no such thing as not is, specifically, they're saying, no, there is not is. There's definitely void. There is a vacuum. And what's happening is that every one of these little particles, they're moving because they're moving from where they were to vacuum and so forth. No, not everybody agrees with that. So obviously we have later Aristotle saying there's no such thing as vacuum. Nature would abhor a vacuum. It would never exist. So then the pluralists then have this other idea, which is, okay, instead of another rejection of this Parmenidean monism, or that goes all the way back to the Milesians, where we're trying to find one unifying principle or seeing everything as unified. Instead, we saw, for example, right when we were at the beginning, we had Empedocles' idea of there being four elements, and there being two kind of cosmic forces that are ordering those elements, and by the attraction that those forces are having, the force towards order, the force towards chaos, that's what's causing the motion. So as we're trying to talk then about it is they're trying to say, okay, if there is there change, and if they're going to say yes, what's causing that change? And if it isn't all just one thing, monism, what is everything made up in? Or is it made up of four elements or atoms and that kind of a thing? So in other words, these are explicitly addressing those issues. And then finally, we also have, at the end here, the response of the sophists, who have powerful and sometimes disturbing answer to these problem of qualities. So that thing that we talked about, is there such a thing as sphericity? Is there redness? Is there taller thanness? Change in identity. Are we changing? If I'm changing all the time, do I actually have any kind of real identity? Socrates' immediate contemporaries, Protagoras and Gorgias, who are founders of the sophist school. We don't have most of their work. They're mostly known by the writings of their enemies, specifically Plato and Socrates. So Plato and Socrates do not like these guys at all, and so defamed them. They have dialogues that are written about them. These become characters. And so there's a lot of, for example, they're stereotyped, so they're emphasized that they're only doing it for money. So the whole point about being a sophist is this thing that Aristophanes is actually accusing Socrates of in the Clouds, which is they're saying essentially Protagoras and Gorgias, the only thing they're doing is they go to these rich kids, who are and they're getting paid all this money in order to teach these rich kids rhetoric and rhetorical tricks, so that then when they go out in the law courts or when they're in the assembly, they're able to speak, very flowery, and they're able to persuade everybody, but they don't have at the center of it the rightness of an argument, because the idea of it is that there is no rightness or argument. There is no such thing as truth. There are, one of the quotes here that is attributed to the sophists is essentially that there are two sides to every argument, and that you can, and specifically that you can make the weaker side win if you have the right rhetoric that you can use. And they have been shown to be right about that in terms of politics, unfortunately on too many occasions throughout all of time. But anyway, so that's so part of what we have. We don't entirely have everything that they're knowing for, but essentially Protagoras is probably arguing that qualities like sphericity or redness or anything like that are not universal, but they're relative. And so a quote that's attributed to him is essentially, man is the measure of all things. And so everything is relative to my measurements, whether I'm taller than someone else or am not taller than someone else. And therefore, there are no absolutes, including truth. So there isn't anything that is actually absolutely right or wrong. There is no such thing as a fundamental human right or anything like that, because all there would be is my rights relative to other humans based on whatever qualities or something like that I have, as opposed to a universal right. And so you can imagine anyway that that whereas they have a strong argument and they're actually really good at making their argument, nevertheless you can imagine that a lot of people throughout time have kind of recoiled at the argument, especially until most recent centuries, where that started to be more had a renaissance. Yeah?
I just come to the conclusion that
Can
we finish the lecture first? So
Okay, well, we're almost done. Why don't we do that, Robert? And I'm just going to get right to the end. So essentially, we are at the end. so I've kind of just seen now that we've gone through this diagram in a little more detail. So we have those Milesians who are talking about whether it's air, whether it's water, whatever the universal monistic principle is, to the Pythagoreans who are looking instead towards truth through sort of more of an inward mystical path of secrecy, but also numerology, that they're seeing maybe mathematics and other kinds of things like that as the underlying principle of the universe, to Heraclitus, who sees everything as being in change, nothing as being fixed at all, to Parmenides, who has really thrown down the gauntlet on the opposite direction by saying that everything our senses are perceiving is illusory and it's all, everything is one. And he has influenced people like the pluralists who argue against that with their elemental theory, and also the atomists who argue against that with their atomic theory. And then finally, Democritus, for example, is one of the teachers of Protagoras. Gorgias is getting at least influenced by Parmenides. And ultimately then also in this whole mix, Socrates, who is also responding to all of these questions. And we can kind of see in the Platonic answer, whether it's Socrates or Plato, but essentially of having the underlying unchangeable infinite forms as opposed, and then the real world that's material of our senses, that everything is changeable and impermanent, and therefore to be eschewed compared to the perfect form of the world of the forms, where the ultimate is good. You can see how this fits very strongly into the context that it's all arising. It's not just getting off the flying saucer and they have this idea, it came out of nowhere, deus ex machina, as we had from the play. So the ideas then of the Pre-Socratics are the environment that led to Socrates, and their questions, I think especially those of the sophists most recently, are still with us today, and we've talked a lot about how some of these are still active questions, and there's other ways in which they are too. So thanks very much.